The autumn of 1983 arrived, not as a gentle descent into colder winds and shorter days, but as a season defined by shadows, long before the sun set, a time thick with the residue of fear that had accumulated across decades of distrust between superpowers whose arsenals were powerful enough to erase civilization in less than an hour. For most citizens of the world, the Cold War had become background noise, a constant ideological hum woven into the fabric of daily life. Children played in schoolyards unaware that their fate depended on machines orbiting thousands of kilometers above their heads. Workers filled factories without knowing that their continued existence relied on the stability of political leaders they would never meet. Families gathered around televisions broadcasting images of distant adversaries, never imagining how a single error, a misidentified signal, or the instincts of one individual standing alone could decide whether the sun would rise again. The illusion of stability shielded billions from the razor's edge upon which the world balanced, a precarious equilibrium shaped by doctrine, fear, and the silent machinery of deterrence. Inside the Kremlin, that equilibrium had already begun to collapse. Yuri Andropov, former KGB chairman turned general secretary, ruled a superpower while confined to a hospital bed, his body failing even as geopolitical tensions soared. His worldview had been molded by decades of intelligence briefings, warning of American deception, psychological operations, and covert strategies designed to cripple the Soviet Union from within before delivering a preemptive nuclear strike. Andropov trusted almost no one. His inner circle filtered the world through a lens of suspicion, sharpened by espionage, ideological conviction, and a belief that the United States viewed war not as a last resort, but as a calculated option. In this state of frailty and isolation, he increasingly relied on the reports produced by Operation Ryan, the most extensive intelligence gathering program the Soviet Union had ever constructed, designed explicitly to detect the earliest signs of an imminent American attack. Analysts scoured satellite images, embassy gossip, military exercises, and even fluctuations in blood donations across the United States, searching for patterns that might reveal hostile intent. Every unusual signal, however trivial, became a data point in a mosaic of alarm. Across the ocean, the United States under Ronald Reagan projected strength with a confidence that bordered on theological certainty. Massive military spending surged through the American budget. New missile systems were deployed across Europe. Aircraft carriers prowled the world's seas. Strategic doctrines shifted toward confrontation rather than compromise. Reagan's speeches, crafted for domestic audiences weary of Soviet expansion, echoed across the global stage with language that sharpened Moscow's fears. When he referred to the Soviet Union as an evil empire, he believed he was offering moral clarity. But in the Politburo, those words were taken as confirmation of Washington's willingness to eliminate its adversary. When Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, a technological vision of a space-based shield that could intercept incoming nuclear missiles, Soviet leaders interpreted it not as defense, but as the removal of America's greatest restraint, the certainty of retaliation. If the United States could destroy incoming Soviet missiles, then the path toward a first strike became frighteningly rational. In this climate, misinterpretation became the real enemy. American strategists viewed their show of force as deterrence. Soviet strategists saw it as preparation for surprise attack. Each exercise conducted by NATO appeared to Soviet intelligence as a possible disguise for mobilization. Every deployment of American Pershing II missiles in Western Europe with their short flight times capable of reaching Moscow in minutes, was interpreted not as defensive posture, but as the spear point of a decapitating strike aimed at the Soviet leadership. The gulf between perception and intent expanded until it became a fault line running beneath every decision, every maneuver, every technological innovation. Deep underground, in a heavily fortified bunker surrounded by forest outside Moscow, the Soviet Union operated Serpukhov 15, the command center for its newly deployed OKO early warning satellite network. The facility was built to ensure that, should the United States launch its missiles, the Soviet Union would know within minutes and could retaliate before its own arsenal was destroyed. The logic was brutal but simple. Survival depended on speed, automation, and the elimination of hesitation. The system needed to detect launches, verify them, and communicate the threat up the chain of command faster than any human instinct could interfere. But OKO was new, untested, and prone to misinterpretation of the natural world it was designed to surveil. Engineers knew the satellites had weaknesses. Their infrared sensors could confuse reflected sunlight with missile plumes and under certain atmospheric conditions. Software algorithms were still being refined. The system performed flawlessly during simulations but had never been tested under the full complexity of Earth's shifting light and weather patterns. It was into this environment that Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov walked on the night of September 25th, 1983. He was filling in for another officer, a minor administrative detail that would ripple through history. Petrov was an engineer by training, a man who understood both the promise and the fragility of the technology he oversaw. He had a reputation for calm, analytical thinking, shaped by years spent interrogating the behavior of machines that could not explain themselves. His duty that night was clear. If the system detected a missile launch, he was to verify the alert using all available data, follow strict protocols, and inform the higher command through secure lines that would trigger deliberations at the highest levels of Soviet leadership. The procedures were designed to be inflexible, no room for personal judgment. The fate of nations was to be guided by the logic of doctrine and the precision of machines. The command center hummed with cold, steady electricity. Screens flickered with orbital paths, telemetry data, and sensor readings. The atmosphere was quiet, almost serene, as operators performed routine checks, logging each step with the mechanical rhythm of practiced efficiency. Outside, the world slept under the indifferent gaze of stars that had watched countless conflicts, yet none with stakes as final as those carried by the arsenals hidden beneath continents and oceans. Midnight passed unnoticed, swallowed by the monotony of routine. Then suddenly, the stillness shattered. A piercing alarm erupted through the bunker, its siren slicing through the air with an urgency reserved only for the gravest possible threat. The main screen blazed red with a single word: launch. The OKO system had detected a missile rising from a silo within the United States. The trajectory data indicated an intercontinental ballistic missile, its plume captured by the satellite's infrared sensors. Operators froze for a split second before training kicked in. Reports were filed, logs updated, procedures initiated. Petrov's heart pounded as he stared at the screen. One missile, by itself, was unusual. It could not cripple the Soviet Union. Yet Soviet doctrine insisted that no American strike would begin with one missile. If a single launch had been detected, more would surely follow. The clock began to tick, a silent countdown toward a decision that could obliterate millions. Petrov demanded secondary confirmation from ground-based radar stations, but no radar could yet see the missile. The Earth's curvature hid low-altitude objects until they rose higher. That delay between satellite detection and radar verification was built into the system, a gap that could stretch minutes, each one an eternity when weighing whether the world was about to end. The bunker filled with the tense murmur of analysts checking data streams, correlating signals, searching for any anomaly that could explain the alert. But the satellite data remained consistent. The system insisted that a missile was rising. Before Petrov could reach any conclusion, the siren screamed again. A second missile had been detected, then a third, then a fourth, then a fifth. The satellite network presented a picture of a coordinated American strike, a limited but targeted assault consistent with the decapitation scenarios studied by Soviet military planners. 5 missiles, aimed at command centers, could theoretically paralyze leadership communications long enough to prevent retaliation. Panic flickered through the bunker, restrained only by the discipline drilled into every operator. Eyes turned instinctively toward Petrov, the commander on duty. The responsibility to interpret the system's warning and relay its certainty or doubt rested solely on his decision. His training told him to trust the system. His superiors expected absolute adherence to protocol. His nation's security doctrine demanded immediate reporting. But Petrov hesitated. His mind raced through American strategic theory. If the United States truly intended a first strike, why launch only 5 missiles? Why risk a retaliation that would devastate its cities? The numbers did not make sense, and he knew the satellite system's flaws. The incident occurred near the autumn equinox, when the sun's position relative to the Earth could cast reflections of high-altitude clouds in ways the infrared sensors struggled to interpret. The alarms felt too clean, too perfectly spaced, too algorithmic to represent actual missile launches. But he had no evidence. He had no confirmation. He had nothing but intuition, logic, and his understanding of the enemy. Minutes crawled by. Officers stared at him with silent desperation, aware that any delay might reduce their nation's chances of survival if the attack was real. Yet Petrov made a decision that defied doctrine. He told his superiors that the report was incorrect. He labeled the alert as a false alarm, directly contradicting the satellite system. He provided no proof, only his judgment, and with that decision he held back the machinery of retaliation that might have transformed the night sky into a curtain of fire. But even after he dismissed the alert, the agony of uncertainty lingered. Ground radar stations finally had the opportunity to detect incoming missiles, if missiles existed. Operators watched their screens with white-knuckled intensity, waiting for a blip that would confirm their worst fears. Seconds passed, then more. The screens remained blank. No missiles came. The world, unaware of how close it had come to annihilation, continued to spin in ignorance. The blank radar screens were more than absence. They were vindication, proof that Petrov's intuition had pierced through the thick fog of fear that surrounded every calculation inside the Soviet command structure. Yet his relief was tempered by the realization that the machinery designed to protect the nation had nearly triggered its destruction. The Oko satellite system, heralded as a technological triumph capable of detecting missile launches with unprecedented speed, had been misled by nothing more than the angle of sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds over the American Midwest. The system had interpreted the reflected light as the infrared signature of rising nuclear missiles, translating atmospheric coincidence into existential threat. That such a simple natural phenomenon could produce the deadliest false alarm in human history revealed a vulnerability that struck at the core of the doctrine underpinning the Cold War, the belief that early warning systems could be trusted to distinguish between war and peace in the narrow window before annihilation. Petrov documented the event as required, though not with the precision demanded by his superiors, who later criticized his report for procedural shortcomings. Yet the deeper truth was more unsettling. The incident exposed a structural flaw that the Soviet leadership was reluctant to acknowledge, admitting that its early warning system had nearly triggered a retaliatory strike would undermine confidence in the doctrine that governed the nation's nuclear posture. The Soviet military machine depended on the assumption that its systems functioned correctly, that its algorithms could pass the difference between light and death, that its officers would follow protocol without hesitation. Petrov's actions, and the complex combination of luck, judgment, and human instinct that led to them, fell outside the boundaries of acceptable military behavior, even if his decision had prevented global catastrophe. Above him, in the highest circles of Soviet power, the context surrounding the incident was shaped by Andropov's growing paranoia. In the months preceding the false alarm, the Kremlin had become increasingly convinced that the United States was preparing to launch a surprise nuclear attack. Operation Ryan's intelligence reports emphasized patterns interpreted as signs of American mobilization, increased communications between U.S. government agencies, heightened activity at certain air bases, and anomalies in American blood bank data. All mundane signals, yet transformed by the filter of fear into evidence of impending war. The leadership's fear was fed not only by American actions, but by the internal fragility of the Soviet state. Economic stagnation bred insecurity. Leadership transitions were increasingly opaque. The KGB reported widespread ideological corruption and declining loyalty across the Eastern Bloc. It seemed plausible to Andropov and his inner circle that the United States perceived Soviet weakness and was preparing to strike before the decline became irreversible. In Washington, meanwhile, the Reagan administration interpreted Soviet behavior as aggression cloaked in weakness. Intelligence analysts noted increased Soviet military alertness, but assumed these measures were routine responses or strategic posturing. The idea that the Soviet Union genuinely feared an American first strike seemed inconceivable. The two superpowers existed in parallel realities, each misreading the other through mirrors distorted by ideology, secrecy, and the assumption that the enemy's intentions matched the enemy's capabilities. By 1983, these misunderstandings had accumulated to form a dangerous substrate beneath every action, every exercise, every speech. The world outside Serpukhov 15 remained unaware of how narrowly it had escaped destruction that night. Trains continued along their routes. Families slept in their apartments, unaware that the thin line between peace and annihilation had depended on the judgment of an officer they would never know. In the sealed corridors of the bunker, the adrenaline began to ebb, replaced by the sober realization that the crisis had ended not because of system reliability, but because one man had questioned the infallibility of a machine. Operators resumed their duties, filing paperwork and restoring the quiet hum of routine. But the psychological wounds would linger. They had witnessed the abyss and had watched their own technology lead them to its edge. For Petrov, the incident marked a turning point. His actions had been guided by experience, intuition, and an engineer's skepticism toward unverified data. Yet he knew that his superiors could interpret his decision as insubordination. He had no guarantee of protection. The Soviet military command valued obedience above independent judgment, and the hierarchy had little room for individuals who deviated from protocol, even when deviation prevented disaster. His official reprimand, ostensibly for improper documentation, was a subtle signal that the system he had saved could not publicly acknowledge its reliance on his personal discretion. In the years that followed, Petrov's career stagnated. He left the military not long after the incident, his health affected by the stress of the job and the weight of the knowledge he carried in silence. But even as Petrov withdrew into obscurity, the world continued to slide toward another crisis. 2 months after the false alarm, NATO launched Able Archer 83, a large-scale command post exercise simulating the transition from conventional to nuclear war. The realism of the exercise was unprecedented. Coded messages, the shifting of command structures, and the movement of military units were designed to mimic the conditions of an actual nuclear escalation. For NATO, it was an opportunity to test communications and coordination. For the Soviet Union, observing from behind the veil of incomplete intelligence, it appeared ominously similar to the preparatory stages of a real nuclear strike. Soviet intelligence officers, already conditioned by Operation Ryan to search for signs of American aggression, interpreted the exercise as potential cover for an actual attack. The Politburo, still shaped by Andropov's suspicion, responded by putting its nuclear forces on heightened alert. Strategic bombers were armed. Missile crews were placed on standby. Nuclear warheads were moved from central storage to operational positions across Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union quietly edged toward full readiness, believing that an attack could come at any moment. In reality, NATO had no intention of launching a strike. The West remained oblivious to the fear that rippled through Soviet leadership as the exercise unfolded. Had a single miscommunication occurred, had a radar station reported an anomaly, had a signal been misread, the Soviet Union might have responded as though war had already begun. Decades later, when intelligence archives revealed the extent of Soviet mobilization during Able Archer 83, analysts were stunned. The exercise had pushed the world closer to nuclear war than most governments realized. And the proximity of that danger made the events of September 26th all the more alarming. The false alarm at Serpukhov 15 had occurred during a period of unprecedented tension, when the Soviet Union viewed every Western action through a lens of suspicion sharpened by fear and failing health at the highest levels of leadership. Had Petrov reported the alert as a confirmed attack, the Politburo, already convinced that the United States was preparing to strike, might have authorized immediate retaliation, believing they were acting preemptively in the final hours before annihilation. The mechanisms of misinterpretation, once set in motion, are difficult to stop. Nuclear strategy depends on rationality and accurate information, yet the Cold War demonstrated repeatedly that fear could reshape signals, turn coincidences into threats, and transform exercises into perceived aggression. The incident at Serpukhov 15 became a case study in how close the world had come to destruction, not through deliberate action but through human error, technological limitation, and the psychological pressure imposed by doctrines promising mutual annihilation. In the aftermath of the false alarm, Soviet engineers undertook extensive reviews of the Oko satellite system. The infrared sensors were recalibrated. Software algorithms were updated to compensate for solar reflections, but these technical improvements could not eliminate the fundamental risk that systems designed to detect the end of the world had to operate perfectly in conditions they could not fully predict. The natural world with its clouds, reflections, atmospheric distortions, and unpredictable patterns, could still confound even the most precise instruments. And in a doctrine built on the assumption that any delay in retaliation could lead to defeat, the pressure to act quickly magnified the consequences of every anomaly. The broader geopolitical context revealed an even deeper irony. Both superpowers had built their strategies around the belief that the enemy would strike first if given the slightest advantage. This mutual suspicion had driven the creation of systems designed to detect launches within seconds and respond almost instantly. Yet the very speed and automation intended to prevent surprise also created the possibility of irreversible mistakes. A malfunction, a misinterpretation, or a coincidence could initiate a chain reaction of escalation beyond human control. Nuclear stability depended not merely on technological reliability, but on the capacity for human judgment to intervene in moments of uncertainty. As the years passed, the story of the false alarm remained hidden, buried within classified reports, known only to a handful of officers. Petrov lived quietly, carrying the memory of the night when the fate of the world rested on his shoulders. His decision had prevented disaster, yet he received no recognition. His contribution to global survival remained a secret. The political landscape shifted as Andropov died, succeeded briefly by Konstantin Chernenko, and finally by Mikhail Gorbachev, whose reforms would lead to the end of the Cold War. By the time the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, the bunker at Serpukhov 15 had faded into obscurity, its critical moment forgotten by the state it had protected. But history, even when hidden, leaves traces. In the late 1990s, retired Soviet officers began to speak publicly about the incident, revealing the extraordinary decision Petrov had made. Western historians, stunned by the details, recognized the magnitude of the event. Awards and honors followed, offered by international organizations and peace foundations. Yet Petrov approached them with the same modest detachment he had shown in the bunker. He insisted he had simply been doing his job. He downplayed the heroism attributed to him, emphasizing instead the flaws in the system that had forced him to act. His humility only deepened the significance of his choice. His restraint had prevented catastrophe at a moment when global tensions were at their peak. Yet the true legacy of that night lies not in the recognition Petrov eventually received, but in the stark demonstration of how fragile nuclear stability truly is. The incident revealed that even the most advanced technologies are vulnerable to the complexities of nature. It showed that political doctrines built on rigid assumptions can drive nations toward the brink. It exposed the inherent danger of relying on automated warnings when the time allowed for interpretation is measured in minutes. And it emphasized that the final barrier between civilization and destruction may not be machines, policies, or deterrence, but the judgment of individuals forced to decide the fate of millions in impossible circumstances. As the world moved into the final decade of the 20th century, the long shadow cast by the events of September 26, 1983, did not immediately fade. It lingered within the quiet halls of military institutions, in the uneasy calculations of strategic analysts, and in the unresolved arguments about whether technology could ever be fully trusted to interpret the complexities of a crisis unfolding at the speed of light. Across think tanks and war colleges, the incident became a whispered example of how the logic of deterrence had come dangerously close to unraveling. And although the political landscape was shifting, Gorbachev introducing reforms that would gradually dismantle the ideological fortress of the Soviet state, The memory of how close the world had come to catastrophe remained embedded within the framework of nuclear strategy. The danger exposed by the false alarm did not stem solely from malfunctioning sensors or flawed algorithms. It emerged from the deeper structure of the nuclear age, in which nations built arsenals capable of ending life on the planet, then relied on systems that had to function with perfect accuracy even though perfection was unattainable. The belief that early warning systems could identify an attack without error, that human operators would respond flawlessly under extreme pressure, and that political leaders would make rational decisions in moments of existential threat, created a framework of expectations that reality could not guarantee. The incident at Serpukhov 15 revealed how thin the line was between stability and annihilation, a line drawn not by technology, but by the judgment of a single individual confronted with ambiguous data and an unforgiving countdown. In retrospect, the political environment of 1983 appears almost designed to produce disaster. The Soviet leadership operated under the assumption that the United States was preparing to exploit any moment of weakness. Economic stagnation and political rigidity created an atmosphere in which fear filled the gaps left by failing systems. The KGB, motivated by its mandate to anticipate threats, interpreted the most mundane information as possible evidence of hostile intent. American leaders, confident in their technological and economic superiority, assumed that the Soviet Union understood the symbolic nature of their rhetoric and military exercises. Neither side grasped how deeply the other had misread its intentions. In the wake of the false alarm, the Soviet military sought to correct the technological vulnerabilities that had nearly triggered an unintended war. Engineers revisited the design of the Oko satellites, recalibrating their sensors, refining the algorithms that interpreted infrared signatures, and adjusting the software to account for the complex interplay of light and atmosphere. But the reforms could not remove the foundational truth revealed by the incident. The natural world could still confound even the most sophisticated systems, and the urgency built into nuclear doctrine, requiring decisions to be made within minutes, left little room to analyze anomalies or question the validity of incomplete data. These vulnerabilities were not exclusive to the Soviet Union. In the United States, early warning systems had also experienced false alarms. During a 1979 incident at NORAD, a training tape simulating a massive Soviet attack was accidentally fed into the live alert system, prompting initial preparations for retaliation until operators discovered the error. In 1980, a faulty computer chip produced erroneous reports of incoming missiles on multiple occasions. American analysts understood that mistakes could occur, but believed redundancy would prevent disaster. Yet redundancy is only effective when systems fail independently. If an entire framework is built around assumptions that amplify fear, misinterpretation can spread like a spark through dry grass. The Soviet false alarm demonstrated that in a highly charged geopolitical environment, even small errors could snowball toward catastrophe. The deeper lesson of the 1983 incident emerged not only from the malfunctioning system, but from the political climate that surrounded it. Andropov's Soviet Union was consumed by suspicion, weakened by economic decline, and governed by a leadership that believed it was under imminent threat. The United States interpreted Soviet anxiety as aggression rather than fear, responding with military exercises and rhetorical offensives that heightened tensions. The incident illustrated how deeply psychological factors influenced nuclear strategy. Decisions were not made by machines alone, but by humans whose perceptions were shaped by ideology, secrecy, and the constant pressure of maintaining readiness for a war that no one wanted to fight. Yet the world did not fully grasp the significance of the false alarm until years later. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the archives that later revealed the details of the incident remained sealed. Even Petrov himself lived in obscurity, his role unrecognized. He spent his post-military years in a small apartment, caring for his ailing wife, haunted by the memory of that night, but unable to share it with the world. Only in the late 1990s, when retired Soviet generals offered interviews to Western journalists, did the outlines of the story emerge. And when Petrov was finally located and interviewed, his account brought the incident to global attention. International recognition followed, though Petrov approached it with the same understated calm that had defined his actions in the bunker. Awards from humanitarian organizations and peace foundations acknowledged his decision as one of the most consequential acts of individual judgment in history. Documentaries chronicled the moment when the world's fate had depended on his refusal to trust a machine that claimed war had begun. Yet Petrov remained adamant that he did not see himself as a hero. He insisted that he had simply done what he believed was logical. He stressed that the system should never have placed such responsibility on a single individual. His humility underscored the uncomfortable truth that the stability of the nuclear age had depended not on policy, doctrine, or technology, but on the intuition of one man who chose to question the machinery designed to interpret reality. But while Petrov's story attracted attention, the broader implications of the incident continued to shape strategic thinking. Analysts began to revisit the assumptions underlying nuclear deterrence, questioning whether early warning systems could ever provide reliable guidance in moments of crisis. Studies showed that even small anomalies in satellite data or radar readings could produce cascading errors. The emphasis on speed, the expectation that retaliatory decisions must be made within minutes, removed the possibility of careful deliberation. It forced decision-makers to choose between risking annihilation by waiting too long or risking accidental war by acting too quickly. And the false alarm highlighted how political tensions could distort interpretation, transforming technical errors into potential catalysts for escalation. As the Cold War ended, political leaders in both the United States and the newly independent Russian Federation faced the challenge of redefining nuclear postures in a world no longer divided by ideological blocs. Arms reduction treaties reduced the number of deployed warheads, but the systems designed to detect launches remained largely intact. Early warning satellites continued to orbit Earth. Radar networks continued to scan the horizon, and the doctrines that emphasized rapid response persisted, though softened by improved communication channels and increased transparency. Yet the structural vulnerabilities revealed in 1983 did not disappear. False alarms continued to occur, though none reached the same level of danger. Analysts warned that as long as nuclear weapons existed, the potential for accidental war remained. The complexity of global politics, combined with the unpredictability of nature and the fallibility of technology, ensured that future crises could still emerge unexpectedly. The story of the 1983 false alarm also influenced discussions about the role of human judgment in nuclear command systems. Some argued that automation should be increased to eliminate the possibility of hesitation or error by operators. Others insisted that human intuition was essential, pointing to Petrov's decision as evidence that machines could not be trusted with decisions of existential magnitude. The debate highlighted an enduring paradox. Nuclear deterrence demands both speed and caution, both automation and human oversight, both readiness and restraint. Balancing these contradictory requirements became one of the central challenges of nuclear strategy in the post-Cold War era. For Petrov, the legacy of that night remained deeply personal. He often spoke quietly of the burden he carried, the knowledge that the world had continued only because he had chosen not to trust what his instruments told him. He described the moment not as an act of heroism, but as a convergence of experience, logic, and circumstance. He acknowledged that another officer might have made a different decision, one more aligned with protocol. He emphasized that he had been fortunate to possess enough information to question the system, yet not so much fear as to be overwhelmed by it. His reflection underscored the role of chance in human history, the fact that he, rather than another officer, happened to be on duty that night, the fact that he had the technical background to doubt the alert, the fact that the political climate had primed the system for misinterpretation. As he aged, Petrov received recognition but not wealth. His life remained modest, defined more by quiet reflection than by celebration. When he passed away in 2017, the news spread slowly, and only months later did the world learn of his death. Yet by then, his story had already become a symbol of the extraordinary responsibility carried by individuals embedded within systems far larger than themselves. His decision, made in isolation and without fanfare, had shaped the course of history. It had prevented a war that would have incinerated cities, poisoned continents, and plunged the world into darkness. The significance of the false alarm lies not only in the disaster it prevented, but in the lessons it offered. It revealed that the greatest threat in the nuclear age is not necessarily the deliberate choice to wage war, but the accumulation of misunderstandings, malfunctions, and misinterpretations that can push nations toward conflict without intention. It demonstrated that the logic of deterrence, though constructed to preserve peace, contains within it the seeds of instability. And it showed that the survival of humanity may depend, at critical moments, on the judgment of individuals whose names remain unknown until long after the danger has passed. The night of September 26, 1983, endures as one of the most perilous moments in human history. It was a moment defined not by weapons launched, but by weapons imagined, not by aggression, but by fear, not by action, but by the refusal to act. It was a moment when technology claimed that war had begun, and one man chose to question the machine. In doing so, he preserved the fragile continuity of a world balanced on doctrines of destruction, revealing at the same time how precarious that balance truly is. And as long as nuclear weapons remain, the memory of that night stands as a reminder of how close humanity came to the edge, and how easily the circumstances that produced that crisis could arise again. For in the end, the greatest safeguard against disaster is not technology, nor policy, nor even strategy, but the capacity for human judgment in moments of impossible pressure. It is the ability to distinguish between light and fire, reflection and reality, coincidence and catastrophe. It is the unwillingness to allow machines to dictate the fate of civilizations. It is the recognition that the difference between peace and annihilation may rest, at any moment, in the hands of one individual standing alone in a room filled with alarms.